Okay, we're going to finish up material for the exam on Monday today. So we're going to talk just a bit more about landscapes, two little topics on landscapes. Then we'll move on to talk about the last major topic in community ecology that we'll cover, which is the global pattern of biodiversity, the global biodiversity gradient. And it's different from the local biodiversity patterns that we have been trying to explain using equilibrium and non-equilibrium ideas. So last time we left off talking about the influence of patch size in a landscape and what it does to populations and why it's difficult for organisms to deal with really patchy, fragmented environments. And what we saw here was we had large patches, medium patches, and small patches. And there was a trend that worked against the animals living in the small patches. First off, animals living in large patches don't have to move very far to find more resources when they use up the resources in a particular area. They just basically walk next door. However, in small patches, you have to go a long distance because you've exhausted this tiny little patch. You have to disperse to a new patch. So if a habitat is fragmented, it forces animals to move farther. The problem with that is that relatively few animals can make those movements. And so the ones that can't make those movements run into trouble. If they're out of resources, they will starve. If they can't find mates, they will not have the opportunity to reproduce. So small patches in highly fragmented habitats, small patches in highly fragmented habitats force animals to move long distances and lowers the success rate of those that try to do it. So it has a net negative impact on population size. Organisms in fragmented habitats can't maintain larger populations the way they can in large habitat patches where the habitat is not as fragmented. Okay, now something to consider. Remember in the paradox of the plankton, we were looking at what looked like a heterogeneous environment, and it was actually quite patchy, although it was not perceptible to our eyes. It's easy to be seduced by the idea that you can see the patches in the environment, but that's not always true. It's not simply patchy distribution of nutrients in bodies of water that produce landscape patches. It's other things as well. And here, let's see, probably turning down the lights for this one would help. Here, these are the Tucson Mountains, which I know well, and I've hiked most of these areas. I've hiked Wild Horse Wash, for instance. But there is what we call a bajada, which is an area of rubble that has eroded from the mountains. The thing is that bajada is very heterogeneous and it's not necessarily obvious to us. Here you have early Pleistocene soils, okay, and these are about 1 million years old. These are middle to late Pleistocene soils. They are eroding from different strata in these mountains, okay, and they are dominated by different species. Now the thing is that both of these species grow in both places, but the relative abundance of them flips. And unless you're looking very carefully, you'll have no idea that that has happened. You need to be very cognizant of the possibility that it's not just obvious things in the environment that produce patches that you can easily perceive. It can be things that are quite hidden from you, like soil characteristics. So the take-home message here is that even though both of these species are found in both of these areas, the relative dominance is quite different. And that means that the species that favor one or the other of these shrubs will also vary in abundance. And functionally, this area of younger soil here may be an unfavorable patch for some species in what looks like a fairly homogeneous desert environment. So you have to be aware that landscape patches can occur at different scales, and they may not be obvious to you initially. You may have to look hard to find the landscape patches. How did we tumble onto these? It was actually the distribution of some insects that wound up tipping us off to the idea that these are not equivalent patches. And in trying to explain why the insects differed in what appeared to be similar looking, sorry about that, guys. Didn't mean to blind anybody over there. Similar looking habitat patches, we discovered that they were actually somewhat different. Okay, now, you may recall that we talked about connectivity previously when we were talking about metapopulations. And habitat corridors can be extremely important in conservation on landscapes. This particular area is an area of eastern Iowa. Iowa City is right over about here. That's the liberal bastion of conservative Iowa. It's where the University of Iowa is. I know this because I got my PhD there. And this is the Amana colonies, which is quite conservative. And you see patches of forest interspersed in a matrix of farmland. But here you have a river in which the forest cover is being maintained. So, hey, this functions as a corridor for movement for forest species. We are looking at the possibility of using corridors for conservation on landscapes in many areas. So an example of Florida's ecosystem corridor is this right here. Here are a bunch of protected areas in between the big population centers of the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast. And you'll notice that they form a corridor all the way from Georgia to the Everglades. Okay, well, this is really crucial for the continued survival of the Florida panther, the basically eastern mountain lion that is native to Florida. Some of you may have heard that the Florida panther was critically endangered some years ago. They had very low genetic diversity, and they translocated some animals from other parts of the southeast in order to basically save the population. That has worked very well, but since this corridor has become established, it's been discovered that there's movement of animals from South Florida into Georgia and back the other way. And by maintaining this corridor, we're having to put a lot less time, effort, and money into conserving the Florida panther. This is not the only example that we have. Here's a Paso de la Danta, which is the tapir. Baird's tapir in Costa Rica is a critically endangered species. If you haven't been to the zoo to see the tapirs, they're about this tall. They're kind of chunky. They look like elephants, but they're not. They're related to hippos. And we have habitat corridors that allow the population to move basically from the Atlantic lowlands, which is really dense tropical rainforest, through the mountains, which is cloud forest, down into the Pacific dry forest, and then down into the Osa Peninsula, which is some of the richest rainforest north of the Amazon. So we have rainforest here, we have even better rainforest here, but they're completely disconnected. However, there is a habitat corridor that allows dispersal. And we've seen dispersal by animals from this area into the southwestern part of Costa Rica. I know this area well. I know that area well. I almost got bitten by a snake here. A friend of mine did get bitten by a snake here, but he was okay. And I've worked in these areas up here in the mountains, these areas in the Atlantic lowlands, and the Osa Peninsula, which is a wonderful place. I encourage you all to go to Costa Rica and see the Osa Peninsula. You will not regret it. So there's my public service announcement for the semester. There are some even more ambitious corridor projects being considered. Here's perhaps the most ambitious. This is the Western Wildway, which would connect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge all the way to Mexico using the Rocky Mountains and existing protected areas in Canada and the United States as a wildlife corridor for wolves, for grizzly bears, for lots of other species that are large and need large areas of contiguous habitat for their populations to survive. Probably very few of you know this, but grizzly bears were once extremely common in Mexico, and they are extinct there now. Gray wolves were common from the Mississippi River west, and they were mostly driven to extinction. Also, there was a population of gray wolves in Mexico that was contiguous with this entire population in North America, and this network of preserves aims to reestablish a corridor for to facilitate movement of these species again, to ensure that they maintain stable and viable populations throughout North America. Now, sounds great, right? Sounds like corridors are the solution to all conservation problems. Unfortunately, no. Corridors have as many drawbacks as they have advantages. For one thing, corridors can provide opportunities for invasive species which badly degrade the habitats that they invade to access new environments. And one of the most common corridors that allows this is roads. And that's because roads function as a disturbance that connects areas of disturbed habitat that might otherwise be isolated, but because they can be connected by roads, they can be invaded by undesirable species. And what you see here is a whole, wow, that's probably purple loosestrife in there, but it's a continuous patch of purple loosestrife, which is one of the worst invaders in eastern North America, that is just moving along this road looking for opportunities to move in and take over native habitats. These species can exploit our disturbances, especially if they connect areas that undergo regular disturbance, but then would normally undergo succession back to native species. They can get in there, they can interrupt normal succession and alter species composition for long periods of time. Okay, last thing that we'll talk about then is the role of landscape engineers in creating patches on landscapes. This is what we were alluding to last time when I said that keystone species aren't always top predators. These are some of the keystone species that alter landscape characteristics, providing niches for many species that would otherwise not be able to persist in environments. So elephants are crucial in East Africa in maintaining savanna because they are the only animals capable of pushing over large trees, and they will push over a couple of hundred trees a day if they are looking for fruit. Well, that kills the trees. It raises the opportunity for savanna species to be maintained in a landscape that would otherwise succeed back into forest very rapidly. And so you'd lose all of those magnificent savanna species like zebra and wildebeest. they are completely dependent on elephants under natural natural conditions to maintain savannas. Alligators build ponds which would otherwise not be available, and just like beavers, although beavers are more northern and function in cold habitats, alligators, crocodiles, they create pools that provide opportunities for aquatic and semi-aquatic species. So they function as keystones, but not in the same way that predators do. Kangaroo rats affect soil nutrients because their urine is highly concentrated in nitrogen, and in desert environments where nutrients are relatively limited, this provides patches of soil enrichment that some plants require in order to grow. They also disperse plant seeds, so they're not just peeing and enriching the soil in areas where they do that a lot. They are actually dispersing seeds to those areas of the plants that require those nutrients. And finally, termite mounds are really important in the Old and New World tropics because they alter soil conditions, they mix the soils, they churn lower horizon soils into the surface horizons, making the soils patchy, and they also alter topography in parts of the Llanos of South America and the Pantanal in Paraguay and Brazil. These are the only areas that are dry all year round. And you'll have hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that are seasonally flooded where some plant species cannot persist because of the flooding that cuts off oxygen to their roots. However, they can persist on termite mounds. So, we have landscape engineers here that function as keystone species, but in a completely different way. They're not regulating competition by lower trophic levels. They are providing niches that would otherwise be unavailable. Okay, so questions about landscapes here. What? No? No question. Okay. All right. In that case, we will, let's see here. Oops, what do we got there? Did I forget something? Oh yeah, I forgot beavers. Well, let's look at beavers for just a second. Oh yeah, and I do have one more thing to say after this. So beavers are famous for creating ponds, just like alligators and crocodiles. And here is a timeline that shows you the change in habitats available around a beaver pond. So here the beavers are becoming established, and this is a landscape which lacked beavers because of hunting, trapping, prior to 1920, and they were able to reestablish themselves in low numbers in the mid-20s, and then over the course of the next 60 years, they turned what was a uniform area of forest with small areas of meadow into a landscape mosaic, which is much, much richer in species. You have openly aquatic species, you have semi-aquatic species, you have dry land, terrestrial, herbaceous species, and you still have some forest there. But these niches would not be present were it not for the activities of beavers. Okay, and interestingly enough, it doesn't just alter species composition; it can also alter the availability of nutrients on the landscape. So you're creating a mosaic of patches, more niches for more species. You're also creating a mosaic of nutrient patches. And we've seen from the paradox of the plankton that that can be very important. That's one of those cryptic landscape features that turns out to explain a lot of distributions that we might otherwise not be able to explain. Now, we've been kind of phrasing landscapes and human interactions on landscapes in a kind of negative way, like humans provide disturbance opportunities for invasive species, humans fragment the environment. That's not inevitable. Here's a example of how humans do fragment environments, right? So this is the Cadiz Township in Wisconsin, and you can see that over the course of 120 years or so, the amount of forest has gone down and the connectivity between the forest patches has basically vanished. So it sounds like things are bad, that we just break things, but that's not necessarily true. We can reverse these trends with even a little attention to what we do. And this is an example of a tract of land in the Netherlands that used to be forest prior to human settlement. It was cleared. It was virtually all agricultural some couple of hundred years ago. And then some of those agricultural areas began to be abandoned because they weren't as productive as some of the others that had been reclaimed from the North Sea. Well, when you abandon those areas, they start to succeed. And so they succeeded into heathland and into forest eventually. And now this is a deliberate policy on the part of the Dutch government in order to create habitat mosaics in Holland that provide opportunities for native species to persist within the country. There is a deliberate policy of promoting abandonment of less productive agricultural land in favor of natural succession processes. And there are tax incentives for landowners to set aside some of their land to do those things. So it's not like humans break everything on the landscape. We can actually reverse detrimental effects that we might have on landscapes. Okay. So a lot of what we say in this course is implicitly or explicitly critical of the way that human society treats natural systems. Want to try to switch into giving you examples of more positive interactions because they are there and they just require a little thought. Okay, now do we have any questions about landscapes before we move on? Okay. So as promised, we will finish this unit on communities by talking about global biodiversity patterns. Okay. Oh. So first we'll explain that pole to equator diversity gradient, which you probably sort of know already. We'll ask whether large-scale diversity patterns are consistent with the explanations that we have developed for small-scale differences in biodiversity. We'll talk about scale dependence of the processes that seem to be important at the global scale. And we'll look at non-equilibrium hypotheses that tend to operate at large spatial scales. We'll spend most of our time on this last point. So, you know that if you have seen pictures of the Arctic or Antarctic, it's mostly ice. You don't see lots of plants or animals in either of those places. If you've seen pictures of equatorial forests, you'll know that they are filthy with plants and animals. So obviously there should logically be a gradient of diversity. Logically, given what you all know as lay people, you should expect greater diversity in the tropics than at the poles. And that's consistent for almost every single group that we have looked at. So this is plant species, and here's the equator at latitude 0. Here's latitude 60, which is the taiga in northern Canada, and here's the number of species and in, say, 10,000 square kilometers. Don't ask me why they use that unit. It's just a convenient unit that you can compare on a map. So that goes down pretty radically. Here's bird species richness, and here you have over 1,000 species, and this is a log scale. So this isn't just a little over 1,000. This is almost 5,000. And down here, this is about 50. So the further you get from the equator, the fewer species there are. So our big question here is, why does this happen, and can we appeal to the same mechanisms, the equilibrium and non-equilibrium hypotheses that we generated for local community diversity differences? Do they work to explain these patterns? Well, the short answer is no, because these are relatively local mechanisms that work on a local scale. Niche space, niche overlap, well, niche overlap, of course, doesn't work, but niche space and specialization rely on local patterns of interactions among species. But we're talking about, differences over thousands of kilometers. Differences in local patterns of species interaction aren't very helpful. Resource availability, do you seriously think there are more mineral resources available in the tropics than the Arctic? It's mineral resources. No, not necessarily. Maybe the amount of sunlight, yes, but this is not a terribly consistent explanation. And these things like disturbance and environmental complexity, these are not consistently different. If you strip away the trees from a landscape in the tropics and just look at the topographic diversity, it's not different from topographic diversity in the Arctic or Antarctic. There are no differences. There's certainly no differences in disturbance regimes. This would require disturbance to be intermediate in the tropics and disturbance to be either extremely common or extremely uncommon in the Arctic and Antarctic, and that is not the case. We see the same range and frequency of disturbances in all of these areas. These explanations aren't terribly helpful. The things that seem to be helpful are things that operate on relatively large scales, like the area of particular biomes. Area is related to speciation and extinction. The larger the area, the more opportunities there are for isolated populations to develop and to speciate. And the larger the area of a biome that's available, the larger the populations of organisms that can be supported. So the lower the extinction rate. So rather than an equilibrium between colonization and extinction, area suggests that there's an equilibrium between speciation and extinction, and that larger habitats will have more opportunities for speciation and fewer risks of extinction. So they should have more species. The general favorableness of the climate is also something that differs over large scales, and we'll get very specific about what we mean by that. The availability of sunlight, as I alluded to earlier, the availability of moisture in some cases. And there's also a huge role of historical accident, as it turns out. So first, we'll take them one at a time. Let's look at area. So first, it's important to understand that our perception of area is inaccurate. So this is the world map that most of us are used to. This is the Mercator projection, and here's Brazil, right? It's about that big. It looks like Brazil is about 2/3 the size of the United States. It looks like Africa here is smaller than Siberia. It looks like Africa is, in fact, not a whole lot larger than Greenland. That's wrong. That's completely wrong. This kind of visualization completely skews our understanding of the relative areas of habitats around the world. This is the Goody projection, which is a bit more accurate. Now you can see, although Greenland is kind of split in half, both South America and Africa are way bigger, which is right. Here's Siberia. You can see that Siberia is nowhere near as big as Africa. So that's more accurate. And here is an equal area projection. And that really flattens out the areas in the far north, which we think of as really big. They are not. These areas that we perceive to be enormous are actually relatively small. And here, the size of Africa, accurately represented in terms of equal area projection, is huge. So as a result, as it turns out, if we fairly measure the area of different biomes around the world, we see that the tropics has by far the largest area of any biome. It has the most species, in large part because it has way more area than nearly all other habitats put together. So here's the areas of subtropical in the northern and southern hemispheres, the temperate, the boreal, which is the taiga, the conifer forest, and the Arctic and Antarctic regions. And notice that there's a skew. The northern hemisphere has way more area than the southern. So it's not like this lower area here is made up for by an equal area down here. There really are huge differences in area. The tropics have more species in large part because they are just bigger. If you have a large area, you have the opportunity for populations to become fragmented and speciate. You also have the opportunity to maintain large populations that aren't at risk of extinction, and so persist over long periods of time. So if you have high rates of speciation and low rates of extinction, you will accumulate more species. End of story. So area explains differences in diversity at the continental scale really well. So here's area in millions of kilometers, and here's some of the larger land areas. Eurasia is by far the largest, although Africa is like the second-ish largest. And pretty obvious. This works within continental scales as well. Here's rainforest area, and here's the different areas of rainforest around the world that we can pick out. And number of species increases with the area of rainforest. This is the South American rainforest here. This is Asian rainforests, African rainforests. It's very clear, area makes a huge difference. Now, the second thing, environmental favorableness, is a bit more complicated. What makes a favorable environment? You have to have access to energy somehow, right? You have to be able to photosynthesize. So we might expect that areas that have high insolation and have lots of energy available might have more favorable conditions and might be expected to accumulate species at a faster rate. And that's, in fact, what we see. Mean annual temperature is related to energy availability. And notice that you have lots and lots of area here that has relatively high temperature. Not only does this area have a relatively high temperature and high light availability, this is the largest area on Earth. We just showed that the tropical habitats are larger than any other area. So you get this huge decrease in mean annual temperature, which is very difficult for organisms to deal with, and these areas are smaller. So these two things interact. As a result, we can ask, how does climate favorability, that is just the opportunities to live in a climate that does not stress you, how does that relate to the diversity of particular taxa? So here's birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, and here's evapotranspiration. So this is a measure of the energy that is available, and these are tropical habitats, right? Evapotranspiration, remember, sunlight falling on the Earth's surface, kind of coming full circle to the first lectures, evaporates that moisture, which then falls as rain. So these are the tropics, these are the temperate areas, and this is the high latitudes. So you see that there's an increase in diversity pretty steadily in these species here. It doesn't increase indefinitely, and we're not entirely sure why we see that particular shape, but there's a really good reason why we see different shapes for reptiles and amphibians than we do for birds and mammals. How do birds and mammals differ from reptiles and amphibians in a very fundamental way? They need less water? Well, that might not be true for reptiles, though. They do differ in reproduction. That's a function of something else, something more fundamental in their physiology. They're warm-blooded. Yeah. These guys really cannot tolerate the cold temperatures that typify these really high latitudes. These guys are warm-blooded, and they can. So we expect birds and mammals to have a different pattern than reptiles and amphibians. The interesting thing is that you do see this increase with energy availability up to a point for all of them. Now, remember that the land area of the northern and southern hemispheres are quite different. A lot more land in the northern than in the southern hemisphere. That is reflected in what makes northern climates favorable and what makes southern climates favorable. They're a little bit different. So energy production by plants is more correlated with species richness in the northern hemisphere. Okay, and this is a function of light availability for photosynthesis. So that seems to be something that drives favorable environments in the north, where you have lots of terrestrial plants. In the south, it's actually water availability that is more related to species diversity. Now that's weird, isn't it? Because the southern hemisphere has way more water. Southern hemisphere is mostly water. So why should water availability be more important in the south than it is in the north? That's weird. It's counterintuitive. What you have to remember is where the land area is in the southern hemisphere. It's mostly between the equator and about 45 degrees south. So we don't have that big northern boreal forest. We don't have the big temperate forest down there. Instead, what we have are big areas of what? Around 30 degrees south. What's the biome that occurs disproportionately around 30 degrees north and south?
Desert.
Desert. Exactly. So very counterintuitively, even though the southern hemisphere is mostly ocean, productivity and diversity in the southern hemisphere is more reliant on water because of where the land is. More of the land area in the southern hemisphere winds up being in potentially arid desert areas than the northern hemisphere. There's more temperate and mesic area in the northern hemisphere that has plenty of rainfall. So it's different. Now, let's look at particular taxa in the northern hemisphere. Here's trees and amphibians and reptiles. And what you can see is that there's an interaction between temperature, which is energy availability, and moisture. Look at where all the trees are. Down here in the swampy south. So it's hot and it's wet. And that's good for trees. And as you go north, you lose the radiation. As you go west, you lose the precipitation. So there's an interaction here. That also works for amphibians. Amphibians are way more common in the southeast because it's warm and it's wet. It's dry this way, it's cold that way. So the sweet spot for both trees and amphibians is there in the southeast. They interact. For reptiles, it's not so clear. Reptiles are more affected by energy availability, that is heating, than by moisture availability because they are less reliant on water. They have adaptations to tolerate living on dry land and living in dry conditions. They're scaly, right? So the big gradient in reptiles is not related to water so much as it is radiation. Okay. Now, last thing, history. Historical accident plays a big role in some diversity patterns. And here's an example. Okay, here's the Mediterranean climates of the Cape region in South Africa, Southwest Australia, and California. The Cape region is really diverse. It has lowlands, it has seasides, it has mountains that are like 9,000 feet high. That's not true of either Southwestern Australia or California. California has mountains, but it's not a Mediterranean climate in those mountains. It is in the Cape. So there are many, many more opportunities for species to colonize niches in the Cape region of South Africa. And that's a complete accident. That is not explained by anything in particular, any pattern of favorability or area. In fact, the Cape region is fairly small by comparison. Okay, and we've had these climate changes that have altered climate in the Cape more than they've altered climate in Southwestern Australia or California. So there have been more biological crises, more opportunities for speciation in South Africa. One last thing before I let you go, and that is forests. Let's look at temperate forests as our last topic in communities. The temperate forests of Europe have some species, and those in eastern North America, they have some species, but look at the temperate forests in East Asia. Wow. The temperate forests in Europe are pretty depauperate. And there are a lot more fossil species in Europe than either East Asia or Eastern North America. So there have been a lot of species in Europe, but a lot of them have gone extinct. And that's not happened in Asia or North America. Why is that? Well, There aren't that many east-west trending mountain ranges in the world. Most of them are north-south. The Alps are a big exception. When you get glaciations in the Alps, you cut off the northern deciduous forest from southern forests. And as the ice advances, drives all those species extinct. That's not so true in East Asia, where most of the mountain ranges are north-south, or in North America, where the mountain ranges are north-south. Most temperate species originated in Asia. They can't get to North America that easily, though, because there's an ocean in the way. So, two historical accidents here. One, Europe, during glaciations, tends to lose a lot of species in their forests. Number two, North America is isolated by an ocean and a continent from the source of diversity in East Asia for forest species. You can't attribute that to area or favorableness. It's historical accident. So those are the big patterns that we think do most of the explanation of the pole to equator gradient. Okay, I'll be I'll be emailing about the next exam a bit. I'll be here on Friday if you want to talk. And if you have things that you think you should have got back that you didn't get back, they're probably up here. Yeah.
What part of mutualism are you including, or is yours?